And now Magnus, rook takes e6, sacrificing the rook versus Hans Niemann. In today's video, Magnus Carlsen shocks Hans Niemann using an insane rook sacrifice in the 2022 Charity Cup KO. Now in the game, Magnus Carlsen opens 1e4, best by test, Hans Niemann goes e5, then we have knight to f3, knight c6, and bishop c4, the Italian game on the board for Magnus Carlsen. Now Hans Niemann responds with a two knights variation, knight to f6, targeting that weak pawn on e4. Now Magnus defends d3 on the board, and then we have bishop c5, the Italian game for Hans Niemann as well. Now here we have castles, and h3 for Magnus Carlsen. The idea being preemptively guarding that g4 square, stopping knight g4, and future bishop g4 ideas from Hans after an early d6. Now here Hans does go d6, opening up that diagonal for the bishop and bolstering that pawn on the 5 square. Now that bishop on c4 could be targeted by the knight. For example, knight to a5 could be incoming. Therefore, c3 is the move, stopping knight to a5 ideas, as then Magnus would have the response b4, forking both the bishop and the knight on a5. Now here Hans Niemann, what does he do? Well, his three main options in this position are going to be a5, expanding on the queen side, a6, or bishop b6. In the game, he does go for a5. This is one of the sharper lines of the Italian game, and the idea behind this move is you do want to stop b4 advances from white, and beyond that, you are giving your bishop on c5 the retreat square on a7 if it needs it in the future. Now from here, Magnus Carlsen, he just continues down the main line of this opening. Rook to e1 on the board, and h6 for Hans Niemann, stopping bishop g5 ideas once and for all. And now here in this position, the main line in this Italian opening is going to be knight b d2 for Magnus Carlsen. But instead of playing that, in this position, he goes for a different idea, d4, immediately expanding in the center. Now this leads to very sharp complications, and obviously it's very good that white does get that powerful pawn center on e4 and d4. However, after Hans Niemann just retreats the bishop with, say, bishop b6 or bishop to a7, then Magnus Carlsen's pawn center could come under fire right away. Now in the game, Hans Niemann does go bishop b6. This is just as good as bishop to a7. Both these moves perfectly playable. And real fast, in this position here, you do not want to take on d4. E takes d4. If you do that, after c takes d4 for Magnus Carlsen, then he will have that c3 square available for the knight, and he will have a fantastic game. So you do have to retreat the bishop back to b6 or a7 in this position. So bishop b6 on the board for Hans Niemann, a very solid move. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, his main problem is going to be how do you defend those pawns on the d4 and the e4 squares? Well, in the game, there's a wide variety of moves he could play. For example, bishop b5 and bishop b3 are both very playable. Instead, bishop b3 on the board, the idea being Magnus wants to go bishop c2, and from there on c2, that bishop will defend the pawn on the e4 square, further bolstering his center. Now in the game, Hans Niemann plays the best idea, rook to e8, simply activating the rook on the soon-to-be open e-file. For example, after e takes d4, that will be a semi-open e-file, and the rook will be very active on e8. Now here, Magnus continues his idea, bishop c2 on the board, defending e4 with the bishop. And now here in this position, Hans Niemann has a choice. The strongest idea, of course, is going to be e takes d4. The idea being, now that Magnus Carlsen has that Italian bishop on the c2 square, you can target it with e takes d4. Then after c takes, knight to b4, hitting the bishop and causing a lot of mayhem in Magnus Carlsen's position. But instead here, Hans Niemann goes for a completely different idea. He breaks in the center with the move d5, and now we have that pawn square in the middle of the board. Whenever you have a pawn square, you know things are about to get very, very exciting. All right, here, Magnus, he finds the best idea, starting by taking on d5. E takes d5, provoking the queen or the knight to come to the d5 square. Now, in the game, Hans Niemann takes with the queen, activating the queen on d5. Queen takes d5 on the board, but now that queen is very vulnerable, and Magnus Carlsen finds a way to target it immediately. He goes bishop b3, reactivating the Italian bishop on the original diagonal in the Italian game, and now that bishop is targeting both the queen and behind it, that very weak square on f7. So, Hans Niemann here, he has to get the queen out of the attack right away, and he finds a decent square for the queen d6 on the board. Of course, there were alternatives, for example, queen d8, also very playable here. Instead, queen d6 on the board, a very active square for the queen. It does help support e5. However, the problem with queen d6, or the drawback rather, is that Magnus Carlsen can bring a knight to the c4 square, and from there it will target both the queen and the bishop on b6. And that will be very annoying. So here, Magnus Carlsen, he has two ways of realizing this plan. One is knight b d2 and then knight c4. The other is knight to a3 and then c4. In the game, he goes knight b to d2. And by the way, both these moves, knight d2 and knight to a3, are equally good. So knight d2, a fantastic move by Magnus. And here Hans Niemann, he has to find the right response. Of course, knight to c4 is coming next. It's very, very hard to stop that idea. So Hans Niemann has to find the right intermediate move to play before that happens. Now, the strongest idea is going to be e takes d4, trying to open up the center, and from there, Hans Niemann will be in an okay position. Instead, he goes e4, a very, very ambitious idea against the greatest chess player of all time. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, of course, his knight on f3 is being attacked. However, before moving the knight, he just jumps in with the other knight to the c4 square. Knight to c4, a very, very strong idea. First of all, again, you are forking both the queen and the bishop on b6, threatening knight takes b6 after the queen moves. However, beyond that, by going knight to c4 first, you can move your other knight up to the e5 square potentially, and that is a much more active square than, say, knight to d2 or knight to h2. So, knight c4 here, a very critical move to play first. Now, Hans Niemann, in this position, he just goes queen d8, getting the queen out of the attack. But now Magnus Carlsen, he spots, again, his knight is being attacked, and he just jumps in with the knight to the very strong e5 square. Knight f to e5 on the board. And here, Magnus Carlsen, already the threats are starting to pile up. For example, you can see that knight and the bishop are both targeting that pawn on f7, the bishop indirectly, and the threats are getting dangerous for Hans Niemann. So here, in this position, he just goes bishop to e6, trying to blunt that bishop on b3 and defend the pawn on f7. Now, this is a very solid move, but of course, Magnus Carlsen, he is not done increasing the pressure. Here, he has a wide variety of ideas he could play. For example, knight takes b6 is very good. Bishop to a4, putting pressure on that knight on c6 and pinning it to the rook on e8 is very good. And beyond that, even ideas like knight g4, trying to trade off black's knight on f6, and if black captures, then h takes g4, and you do get a battering ram pawn on the g4 square, and you can threaten g5 in certain lines. But instead here, Magnus, he finds a move that is very, very typical for his games. He finds a way to maintain the tension and keep all of those threats alive. He just goes bishop f4, supporting that knight on the e5 square. Now the idea is if Hans Niemann takes on e5, knight takes e5, he can recapture with the bishop instead of the knight. And by keeping the knight on c4, he maintains these bishops on the board as well, and that is to his benefit. So, bishop f4, a very good waiting move by Magnus Carlsen. Now here in this position, Hans Niemann, he immediately blunders after this move bishop f4 by Magnus. He goes knight d5, and this turns out to be an incredibly weak move. Instead, you have to take that knight on e5 right away. Knight takes e5, try to trade off material and making your defensive task a little bit easier. But instead, knight d5 on the board. And now what is the problem with this move? Well, it turns out this move just blunders the pawn on e4, and Magnus Carlsen can take it. Of course, this knight going to d5, it does target that bishop on f4. So now Magnus Carlsen has to calculate. If you go rook takes e4 and Hans Niemann goes f5, trying to knock back the rook, do you lose the bishop on f4? Is that a possibility? Well, don't worry. Magnus Carlsen, he calculated everything out in advance. He hopped into his time machine and he saw into the future and he saw, yes, you can indeed play this move. Rook takes e4, and not only can you play it, it is a brilliant move if you follow up correctly. Now here, Hans Niemann in this position, he goes f5, expanding on the king side, again, try to drive back the rook. If Magnus goes, say, rook to e1, then knight takes f4, wins the bishop. So Magnus, he has to find the right way to deal with this threat immediately. Now, in the game, he finds the idea. Knight takes c6. First of all, you trade the knights. You are hitting the queen on d8 with tempo. Therefore, b takes c6 is literally forced from Hans Niemann. And now, in this position, Magnus Carlsen busts out his brilliant idea. He sacrifices the rook on e6. Rook takes e6 on the board. And this is where the game gets really crazy. Here, obviously, Hans Niemann does have to recapture. Rook takes e6 back. And now let's do a quick inventory. Here, Magnus Carlsen gave up that rook on e6. In return, he does get Hans Niemann's light-squared bishop and a single pawn, and black's pawn structure on the queen side is absolutely shattered. And beyond that, black's king on g8 is now very, very weak as he had to play that move f5, opening up this diagonal for the bishop. So overall, Magnus Carlsen gets a bishop, a pawn, and a devastating attack for the rook, and that is more than enough compensation in this position. All right, here, Magnus. He simply goes bishop e5. getting the bishop out of the attack of the knight. Of course, there were a wide variety of other squares for the bishop. For example, bishop h2, bishop d2, and so on are all very playable. But instead, bishop e5 on the board, staying very active with the bishop. Now here, Hans Niemann. The computer likes the idea of just slowly, passively defending with, say, g6, king to h7, and so on. But that is a slow, miserable death. And Hans Niemann, if you follow his games, he is a very aggressive attacking player. He loves to attack with black and with white. And in this position, his first instinct is, how do I get active against Magnus Carlsen? So with that in mind, he swings his queen over to the king side. Queen g5 on the board, a very, very active move. And from here, Hans Niemann does have threats like knight to f4, potentially threatening checkmate in one move on the g2 square. So Magnus Carlsen is going to have to react. In the game, he goes queen to f3, preemptively guarding that g2 square with the queen and activating his queen on the king side. Now here, Hans Niemann, he has a very difficult defensive task. The computer finds all sorts of crazy ideas like a4, trying to nudge back the bishop. Instead, he just goes rook d8, trying to get the rook active, but this turns out to be a slightly dubious move. And here, Magnus Carlsen, he finds an absolutely beautiful combination to increase the pressure. Now, if you like tactical puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to find the beautiful idea for Magnus Carlsen in this position. And while you're at it, go ahead and smash that YouTube like button. Thank you so much for doing that. It helps me out so much. Now, the key idea for Magnus Carlsen in this position, he starts by taking the bishop on b6. And the idea is he wants to open up this diagonal with the bishop on the king and then go c4 and maybe c5. Again, just trying to create mayhem on this diagonal. So here's how it works. Knight takes b6 on the board. Hans Niemann is forced to take back with the pawn. If you take with the knight, you lose the rook on e6 with check. That is not an option. So b takes c6, recapturing and improving his pawn structure on the queen side. But of course, Magnus Carlsen, he is not done. He expands with the move c4. The idea being, if the knight moves, then you're going to go c5, opening up the attack on the rook and the attack on the pawn on b6, and Magnus may be able to win a pawn here. Now, Hans Niemann, again, he is not one to passively defend. So in this position, he returns the favor, and he actually sacrifices the rook against Magnus Carlsen. Rook takes e5, the audacity of Hans Niemann in this position. Now, of course, in this position, Magnus Carlsen is going to recapture on e5. So d takes e5 on the board, and now you still have these threats on this diagonal with the bishop. What is Hans Niemann planning? Well, he jumps in with the knight, knight to f4, trying to stay active on the king side. Potentially, he may be able to generate threats on the king side. For example, if rook d2 comes, that would be a little bit scary for Magnus. However, now here, c5 on the board, opening up the discovered attack on the king and the attack on the b6 pawn. So Hans Niemann, he has to get his king out of the attack. He goes king to h7, good square for the king. But now in this position, Magnus Carlsen finds an absolutely brilliant idea. Now you can say, take on b6, win a free pawn, and threaten to push it down the board to b7 and then b8. That is very playable. However, instead, he finds a stronger idea. h4, an absolutely beautiful move. The idea being, if the queen takes, you want to go g3, forking both the knight and the queen on h4. And if he doesn't take, then you do gain space on the king side and disrupt black's coordination. So what is Hans Niemann going to do here? In the game, he actually just takes on h4. Queen takes h4. And again, the alternatives are not good. For example, if you retreat the queen, then you lose the knight on f4. That being the other idea of this h4 move from Magnus. So queen takes h4 on the board, the only good move. But then Magnus busts out his idea. g3 on the board, again, forking both the queen and the knight on the f4 square. Now Hans Niemann, he has to find the right follow-up. Again, if you retreat the queen, say queen to e7, you do lose the knight on the spot. Therefore, the only good move is going to be knight to h3, hitting the king with tempo and keeping the game going. Now, king g2 for Magnus Carlsen, and again, Hans Niemann finding a brilliant idea. Queen to g4. Now the queen is defended by the pawn, and if you go queen takes g4, then f takes g4, keeps the knight defended on the h3 square. So, brilliant stuff by Hans Niemann. And I know you guys in the comment section on this video may say it looks suspicious or whatever, but I completely disagree. Very good move by Hans Niemann. All right, now queen takes g4, and then f takes g4 on the board, and then c takes b6. Now Magnus Carlsen getting that pass pawn on the b6 square, threatening to go b7 and then b8, promoting to a queen. Very strong stuff. Now Hans, knight g5, trying to get his knight back into the game where it can defend. And here Magnus Carlsen, he is only up one pawn in this position. However, the kicker is he has two pass pawns, one on b6, one on e5, and his pawn structure is better, Hans Niemann having those 3 pawn islands versus the 2 of Magnus Carlsen. And those two factors combined, plus the bishop versus the knight, gives Magnus a huge advantage here. And he just increases the pressure immediately. e6 on the board, threatening e7 and maybe e8, or even b7, b8. And now the rook has to defend both the e-pawn and the b-pawn. All right, king g6 on the board. Hans Niemann trying to bring his king back into the game, but then e7 hits the rook on the d8 square. Now rook to e8 threatens the pawn, but Magnus is on top of things. He goes rook to e1, a very good move. And I do want to point out real fast, instead of rook to e1, you can technically go b7, because if the rook takes on e7, then you just go b8, promoting to a queen, and that would be absolutely devastating for Hans Niemann. So, very interesting idea, but instead, rook to e1 on the board for Magnus. Now here, knight to f3 for Hans, jumping in with the knight, potentially trying to go, say, knight to d4, maybe knight f5, just trying to stay active with the knight and targeting that bishop and that pawn on the 7 square in the process. Now here, Magnus, rook e3, getting his rook out of the attack of the knight, that being the other idea of knight to f3. And now knight d4 for Hans, once again, trying to target that bishop. If he gets knight takes b3 in the game, he may have a fighting chance. But here, Magnus Carlsen, he does not slow down. He just goes b7, a brilliant idea, expanding on the queen side, potentially threatening b8, promoting to a queen. Then you distract the rook, and then you go e8, promoting to a queen again, and you win black's rook. So that is the big threat here. Now in this position, Hans Niemann, knight to f5 on the board, forking both the rook and the pawn on e7, but Magnus Carlsen, he is not amused. He just jumps in with the rook to the very good e6 square, forking both the king on g6 and the pawn on c6. After the king moves, the idea is rook takes c6, and then perhaps rook to c8, and pushing that pawn down to promote to a queen. And for that reason, in this position, Hans Niemann, he is defenseless, and he just resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen and his incredible play from this game. Wow, what a game by Magnus Carlsen and his new arch nemesis, Hans Niemann. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like the video, and check out this video right here, where Magnus Carlsen literally disrespects Hans Niemann in the opening by sacrificing his rook on the e3 square on move 12. That game was incredible, so check that out, and I'll see you in the next video.